Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. I hope you are having a warm and safe holiday season. Today we are going to be continuing last week's video announcing my new collaboration with Da Vinci Paint Co. If you haven't seen the first video yet, I will link it up above, and once you're all caught up, head back here to take a look at some demonstration paintings using this new palette. My Embrace Opacity palette has a really special approach to watercolors that some people may not be as familiar with, and many of you had questions, so I'm hoping to answer them today. As I mentioned in the last video, these naturally opaque watercolors are not gouache and they are certainly not acrylic. They still handle like other watercolors, but they have some different visual qualities to them that you just can't get with transparent watercolors. Today I have 4 demonstration sketches to show you how I enjoy using them, so let's get started. We are going to start off with a sketch of a wildebeest. I have a fondness for painting brown ungulates, though I know they are not as eye-catching on social media as more brightly colored animals. However, it was really important to me to show off the beauty of the cool, dark brown mixes that this palette can create, and a wildebeest was a perfect subject for that. Here you can see I am beginning the painting using raw sienna, a light tannish brown color in the palette that can often be used straight from the pan or tube. Next, I am using some Naples Yellow Deep to block in some of the loose, wet washes, gently suggesting a savanna-like background. You can see how these two similar colors give distinctly different vibes, which is why they are both on the palette for their different uses. Here we are going to mix up some of that cool brown that I mentioned before using terracotta and stormy blue. These two colors neutralize each other gorgeously, ranging from a warm middle brown to a cool dark brown to even a warm black and everything in between. The usual go-tos for a cool brown like raw umber and sepia were too transparent for what I envisioned for this palette. I definitely wanted to show off how even though those colors are not included, we can still get a gorgeous range of cool browns filling that very necessary niche. After the first layer has dried, we are just going to continue painting as we would with any other watercolor. I am working left to right in this piece so that I don't drag my hand through wet paint, and I am generally trying to map out the darker shadows as I go. While still in this value map stage, these are by no means going to be my final values, but they will guide me to where I want to go. This painting also shows off one of the things I love most about working with opaque watercolors, with wildlife in particular, though I'm sure that it could be applied to other subjects as well. These naturally opaque pigments have larger particle sizes than most transparent pigments. This larger particle size sits more so on the surface of the watercolor paper rather than sinking in right away, giving us lots of time to play with our washes. We can push around the pigment to exactly where we want it using wet or damp brushes depending on the effect that we want. This is a fine dance that takes some practice, but I just love it so much. It is important to note that a lot of the darker opaque watercolors will have a pretty big drying shift, meaning they will get significantly lighter as they dry, so don't be afraid to lay in lots of pigments for your darker values. Since these paints tend to sit on top of the paper instead of sinking in like the more staining transparent watercolors, they don't typically glaze as crisply. This isn't inherently good or bad, it's just something to be aware of. When I work with these pigments, I know that I will be using fewer layers, so I want to start building texture right away. Next, we're using stormy blue straight from the pan for some dark, nearly black values on the wildebeest's face. Because of the properties that we've already discussed, I can lay in this color pretty heavily and then just gently lift out some of the pigment that I want to be slightly lighter in value. I can add a little terracotta to the stormy blue to shift the hue to just off black to be an extremely dark brown, which I'm using here for the tail. Using a similar mixture but watered down slightly, I can start laying in the shadows for my next layer. I want to point out the really stunning textures of the first wash on the thigh and hindquarter area. You can of course get this effect with transparent watercolors, but I find it comes so much more easily with the softness of these opaque pigments. The areas that have more paint slowly soften off into the rest of our wash, making an almost effortless, smooth transition between light and dark. You can also see here how I use my go-to technique of placing a stroke down and then softening off an edge to really control my washes. On that first layer of the neck, I began adding some texture for the stripes in the Wildebeest's coat, and here I'm going to strengthen these markings with another layer. I should mention, in case you are finding me for the first time here on this channel, that I use silver black velvet brushes for the vast majority of my painting. I'm not sponsored by them in any way, nor have I even worked with them in the past. I am, however, mentioning it because they are very soft brushes, meaning there is less of a chance of me disrupting the layers of paint below. I also work on cotton paper, so if you are using stiffer brushes and/or cellulose paper, you may not be able to achieve the same results that I am getting here in this video. As much as I love this palette and these pigments, I always say to invest in your paper first, then brushes, then paint, in that order. Your paper will make the biggest difference and will be absolutely worth your investment. I have been using a size 8 round brush for the entirety of this small sketch, including these little itty bitty shadows on the back of the hooves. Another thing that I love about these brushes is how fine of a point that they have and how well they keep their points over time, so you really don't need a wide variety of sizes. If I could only paint with a silver black velvet size 8 round for the rest of my life, I would manage just fine. So while a brush is an important investment, if you have the right one, you really don't need a large assortment. For the shadow underneath the Wildebeest, I switched to the gentler Denise's Gray mixed with a little bit of terracotta. Denise's Gray is also used on the horns, and all around you can see that it is just a softer color than the stormy blue for when you need a gentler touch. Next, we are going to paint a harbor seal, and just for the sake of variety, I did pull out a flat synthetic brush to start things off. This first wash is going to be a mixture of Denise's Gray and Lilac. I'm sorry about the glare, I caught it and changed the angle in just a moment. You can see in this very wet wash, the cerulean blue starts to separate out from the Denise's Gray, adding a lot of texture, and hints of that Indian red as well as the lilac can be seen underneath it. While the paper was still wet, I tapped some splatters of the same paint mixture into the wash to create a speckled texture of the harbor seal's coloring. And now I can switch back to my trusty round brush to work on the finer features of the face. However, before jumping into the details, I will first place the shadows that define the forms of the head. It's important that we do the contours first so that we don't disrupt the more concentrated pigments that will be sitting on top of the paper for our darkest values. One of my goals for this painting was to show off how different Denise's Gray can look depending on how it's handled. On the body of the seal, which was painted with lots of water and with big strokes, the cerulean blue has very clearly separated and granulated, creating a really beautiful but distinct texture. However, I am using the same mixture on the face and it reads as a more uniform gray. This is because I am using less water and smaller, more focused and precise brush strokes. I am telling the paint exactly where I want it to be and soaking up any excess water with my brush to dissuade it from veering off course. If you'd like more instruction on water control skills, I have a very detailed class on Skillshare. I'll put a link in the description. For the background, I continued the lilac undertones but mixed it with the Naples Yellow Deep to create a peachy pink splash background. Now with the first layers fully dried, we can go in with some darker values. I'm using Denise's gray here on its own, but in a more concentrated form. I did switch to a smaller brush to avoid running into the tiny little eyes while softening off the brows. Moving back to the body, we have switched back to our size 8 to adjust some broad overall values that define the shape of the seal. Then back to the face again for a few more tiny details. For those darkest values, I have switched to the stormy blue as Denise's gray never quite reads as black. This will help the eyes and nose stand out against the contours of the face. Finally, I finished the sketch with some fresh white gouache for the whiskers, which is not included in this set. However, I use white gouache on most of my paintings regardless of the transparency or what set they're in, so I did the same for this one to make those final features pop. Our final page of sketches is a 2-for-1. I will be painting both a green tree python and a swan on the same page. In real time, I was switching back and forth so that I could let layers dry in between, but I have kept the footage together so that you're not having to bounce back and forth. For the green tree python, the colors that I will be using are Naples Yellow Deep, Chromium Oxide Green, Cobalt Turquoise Deep, and Stormy Blue. Opaque pigments aren't my first thought when reaching for my watercolors to paint reptiles. Often we think of reptiles as being very smooth and sleek, which resonates well with a lot of quinacridones and phthalos. However, the texture of the scales while using opaque pigments is very different from the scales using transparent pigments, and they are well worth sharing in this video. Plus, I wanted to show off that Cobalt Turquoise Deep, and this python was perfect for that. Given how long this video is and the number of paintings I was doing all at once, I am moving through this footage pretty quickly. However, I still think that it shows off the unique nature of using this palette for perhaps a less expected subject. We can see that soft first flat layer as well as the additional glazes adding texture to the sketch. The opaque pigments are pretty forgiving, so you can place a lot of scales down at once before having to go back and soften off edges. Towards the back of the head and on the body, I switch from more defined scales to more suggested ones. I can dabble in these darker values and then soften off some of the edges for a really pretty texture. This reference photo was lit with a strong light above the snake, which allowed for a big old wash of the stormy blue as a shadow, mixed with just a hint of the Cobalt Turquoise Deep to anchor it into the color palette. While that wash was still wet, I dabbled in some of the Cobalt Turquoise Deep and Chromium Green Oxide next to that dark wash to suggest some more defined scales on the areas that the light touches. I'll continue adding texture until I'm happy with it, and then move on to the final details. The final sketch will be the quickest one, but it was important to me to show off an even softer side of this palette with a more atmospheric piece. I personally do not paint landscapes, but I think this palette would be perfect for an atmospheric piece, and I can't wait to see what you all do with it. As a side note, please tag me on Instagram with anything you create. I am so excited to see them. Okay, back to our swan. I started this painting with a completely wet wash across the entire sketch, bird and all. Using very diluted washes, I tried to enhance the colors that I saw hints of in the reference photo. We have a peachy color mixed from lilac and Indian red, the lilac on its own, some Naples yellow deep, a bit of Denise's gray mixed with the cerulean blue, and then Denise's gray mixed with the chromium oxide green. I don't usually paint with this many colors in one piece, but I was trying to show off as many of the palette's colors as I could for this piece. Once the colorful first wash was dry, I moved on to some more localized details. Small wash, dry paper, then softening off the edges like I am one to do. Most of these smaller washes were using Denise's gray. For the beak, I used Naples yellow deep and Indian red. I dried that with a heat tool and then placed Stormy Blue straight from the pan for the contrasting black details. Using a small brush, I flicked in some hints of feather texture using some of that lilac on the neck in particular. And that'll do it for the swan. She was a quick one, but honestly, like I mentioned, this style is not my strong suit, and I'm hoping to see some other artists more skilled in this area try their hands at showing off this style. So I want to hear what you think now that you've seen the palette and the paintings. Are there colors that you'd like to try out? Which painting or specific technique was your favorite? Do you already have the palette? If so, which color or color combinations are your favorite? Tell me all about them in the comments below. Denise's Embrace Opacity palette is available at Da Vinci Paint Co. There is a link in the description below. That's going to be a wrap for 2022, so I look forward to seeing you in the new year. Thank you for watching. Thank you to my wonderful patrons. And until next time, my friends, happy painting.